Was she supposed to survive? A child, locked away like an animal, trapped in the bitter cold, her body wasting away with each passing day. No food. No water. No escape. Her cries went unheard. Her pain ignored. And as the world moved on, she sat in the darkness of that filthy chicken coop, waiting. Waiting for someone to save her. Waiting for the end. But survival has a way of choosing its own warriors. And against all odds, she lived. But the nightmare she endured? That will haunt her forever. This is the horrifying story of a 15-year-old girl, locked in a chicken coop for months, starved, neglected, and treated like she was nothing. And the people responsible? The ones who did this to her? Her own father and his girlfriend. But why? What could make a man, her own blood, turn against his child like this? How could a woman stand by and let it happen? And most importantly, how did this girl finally escape? Tonight, we unravel the chilling truth of what really happened behind that closed door. But first, let's go back to the night the nightmare finally ended. The truth was never meant to come out. 4 months she suffered in silence, hidden in plain sight, just steps away from a warm home. She was starving while food sat in the kitchen. Freezing while blankets lay untouched inside. She was their daughter, but they treated her like a burden. Like something less than human. But monsters always make mistakes. And this time, their cruelty reached the ears of someone who refused to stay silent. It started with a phone call. A woman's voice, shaky and urgent. It was the girl's grandmother. She had always worried about her granddaughter, always sensed that something wasn't right. But when the girl finally got the chance to whisper the truth, the horror was worse than anything she could have imagined. Locked away. Starved. Forced to live in filth. The grandmother's hands trembled as she dialed. "Please," she begged the operator. "You have to help her. You have to get her out." The line went silent. Then, confirmation. Officers were on their way. Lights. Sirens. A knock on the door. Inside, the house was warm, neat, ordinary. The smell of dinner lingered in the air. A television buzzed softly in the background. A man, her father, answered the door. Beside him, his girlfriend. Come. Unbothered. As if they had nothing to hide. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice steady. But the officers weren't here for small talk. They stepped inside, scanning the room. Something felt off. The other children were there, fed, dressed, unharmed. But there was no sign of the girl. Then one officer noticed something outside. A small wooden structure. A chicken coop. The officer's stomach twisted. He stepped closer. The air smelled of waste and decay. The lock on the door looked old, rusted, but secure. Too secure. "Open it," one officer demanded. The father hesitated. "There's nothing in there," he muttered. "Just the coop." The officers didn't believe him. They grabbed the lock, forced it open, and inside, a girl, thin, pale. Her body curled into itself as if trying to disappear. Her eyes, wide, hollow, stared up at them. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just existed. One officer knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "It's okay. You're safe now." But the girl barely reacted. She had forgotten what safety felt like. The officers exchanged looks. This was more than neglect. This was something much darker. A voice cut through the silence. One of the neighbors had gathered outside, watching. Someone whispered, then another. "We never saw her. We didn't know. But someone must have known. Someone must have heard something. So why? Why did no one come sooner? No child should live like this." The officers stood frozen, their breath visible in the cold night air. The chicken coop was small, too small for a human. The floor was covered in dirt, feathers, and waste. The stench was overwhelming. A bucket sat in the corner, her only bathroom. A thin, filthy blanket was crumpled beside her. And the girl, she didn't cry, didn't beg for help. She just stared. Her body was frail, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her skin, pale, bruised, covered in scratches. Her hair, matted, tangled, falling over her hollow face. She was so thin, so weak, it looked like a breath of wind could knock her over. But the worst part wasn't how she looked. It was her eyes. Empty. Lifeless. Like she had already accepted her fate. One of the officers swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "How long have you been out here?" Silence. The girl blinked slowly as if processing the question. Her lips cracked as she whispered, barely loud enough to hear. "A long time. A long time." The officers exchanged looks. They needed answers. But the truth was more horrifying than they could have imagined. For months she had been locked away. No bed. No heat. No human touch. She ate once a day if she was lucky. A single pack of ramen noodles, dry and uncooked. Sometimes they would pour water over it. Sometimes they wouldn't. That was her meal. That was all she got. She was allowed inside the house, only to use the bathroom. But even that was limited. She had to ask for permission, had to wait. And if they didn't feel like letting her in, she used the bucket. While the rest of the family sat inside, warm, fed, laughing, she was out here. In the cold. In the dark. Alone. No one tucked her in at night. No one checked if she was okay. She listened to the sounds of the house, the muffled voices of her siblings through the walls. She wondered if they ever thought about her, if they ever missed her, or if they had already forgotten she existed. Investigators dug deeper. They found messages, text conversations between the father and his girlfriend. Messages that showed pure cruelty. They talked about her like she was nothing, like she was a burden, like she deserved this. And the more they uncovered, the clearer it became, this wasn't just neglect. This was torture. One officer clenched his jaw, holding back the anger rising in his chest. How could they do this? Someone whispered. No one had an answer. But they weren't done yet. Because inside that house, in the warmth of that living room, sat two people. The ones responsible for this. And now the officers were going to confront them. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a father. A woman who's supposed to care. People who should protect a child, but instead they destroy them. Jammy Jackson. Patricia Madrid. The people behind this horror. From the outside they seemed ordinary. Just another couple in a small New Mexico town. They had a house, a family, other children living under their roof. But behind closed doors they were something else. Who was Jammy Jackson? A father. But not in the way a father should be. He was cold, short-tempered, controlling. He had a history of run-ins with the law, assault, theft, drugs, but nothing that hinted at the true cruelty he was capable of. People who knew him described him as harsh, unforgiving, always looking for someone to blame. And too often that someone was his daughter. She wasn't like the other kids. Maybe that's why he treated her differently. Maybe that's why he decided she didn't deserve a normal life. And then, there was Patricia Madrid. His girlfriend. The woman who should have stepped in. Who should have protected that child. But instead, she helped him. She was no better. No one knew much about her. She kept to herself. But her silence was deadly. She didn't just stand by and watch, she participated. Investigators found text messages. Messages that exposed just how cruel they really were. One message from Patricia. Did she ask for food again? Jammy's response. Yeah. I told her no. She needs to learn. Learn. Learn what? To live without food? To suffer in silence? Another message from Jammy. She doesn't deserve to eat today. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow. This was how they talked about her. Like feeding their own child was some kind of privilege she hadn't earned. More messages. Conversations filled with pure hatred. She's lucky she even has a blanket. If she wants to act like an animal, she can live like one. It was clear. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just bad parenting. This was abuse. Intentional. Deliberate. Calculated cruelty. And yet, inside that house, with its warmth and its comforts, there were other children. Healthy. Federal, untouched. Why was this girl singled out? Why was she the only one suffering? And the biggest question of all, did the other children know? Did they hear her cries? Did they see her disappear into the cold night, night after night? And if they did, why didn't they say anything? This should have never happened. This girl should have been safe. She should have been in a warm bed, eating dinner at the table, going to school like every other child. But instead, she was in that cage. The question is, why didn't anyone stop it? Because someone had to know. This kind of cruelty doesn't happen overnight. It builds. It escalates. And along the way there are always signs. Always warnings. Did anyone notice? Let's start with the neighbors. The ones who lived just steps away. When the police came they stood outside watching. Whispering. We never saw her. We didn't know. But is that true? Because investigators later found out, some of them did know. Some had seen things. Some had heard things. A few even admitted they had concerns. But they never spoke up. They told themselves it wasn't their business. They didn't want to cause trouble. They looked away. And then there was the school. She had been enrolled once. A long time ago. But then, she just disappeared. No explanation. No follow-up. No questions asked. How does a child go missing from school, and no one asks why? It wasn't until much later that investigators found out, Child Protective Services had been called before. There were reports, complaints, warnings. Teachers had noticed bruises. They had noticed how thin she was, how withdrawn, how afraid. And someone, a teacher, a counselor, maybe even a doctor, had called it in. But nothing changed. CPS came. They knocked on the door. They asked questions. And Jammy Jackson had answers. She's just clumsy. She doesn't eat much, she's a picky eater. She's homeschooled now, that's why she's not in class. And somehow that was enough. The file was closed. The case, marked as resolved. And that little girl? She went back to her cage. Months passed. The abuse got worse. And no one came back to check. No one came to save her. The system was supposed to protect her. But instead it left her to suffer. And now, after everything she endured, there's one last question. What happens to her now? They thought they got away with it. For months they locked her away. They ignored her cries. They starved her, humiliated her, treated her like she was nothing. And for months, no one stopped them. But that night, as the flashing red and blue lights filled the sky, as the sound of police boots echoed across the cold ground, their time was up. The officers moved in fast. Guns drawn. Voices firm. Step out of the house. Now. Inside, Jammy Jackson and Patricia Madrid froze. They had been expecting this moment. Maybe not that night. Maybe not so soon. But they knew. They knew the girl had been found. They knew the lies had caught up to them. And yet, they still thought they could talk their way out of it. The arrest. Jammy Jackson came out first. Hands up, acting calm. What's this about? He asked, his voice flat, uninterested. Like he had just been pulled over for a broken taillight. But the officers weren't playing games. Turn around. Hands behind your back. The cuffs snapped around his wrists. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control anymore. Then came Patricia. She stepped outside slowly, arms wrapped around herself. She looked at the officers. Then at the neighbors gathering on the street. Then back at the house. Her mouth opened, as if she was about to explain. As if she had a reason for all of this. But there was no reason. No excuse. Because inside that chicken coop in the freezing dark, was a girl who had almost been forgotten. And the people who did it were standing right here. Denial or confession? At the station the questioning began. Jammy denied everything. We took care of her. She's lying. We didn't do anything wrong. Patricia? At first she stayed quiet. She didn't defend herself. She didn't defend Jammy. She just sat there staring at the table, hands shaking. Then finally she spoke. I didn't want to hurt her. But that wasn't the truth. Because she had hurt her. Over and over again. And now they were both facing 14 felony charges. Child abuse. Neglect. Conspiracy. They had destroyed a child's life. Now the law was coming for theirs. The judge's controversial decision. The town waited for justice. The people demanded it. The evidence was overwhelming. The text messages. The injuries. The chicken coop. The prosecution fought hard. These two should never walk free again. But then, the judge made a decision that no one expected. Jammy Jackson and Patricia Madrid, released. No bail. No ankle monitors. Free to go. The courtroom erupted. Gasp. Shouts. Disbelief. How? How is this possible? A child had suffered for months. And yet, the people who did it were walking out the door. But this wasn't over. The trial was coming. And this time, the world was watching. Would justice finally be served? Or would the system fail this child again? Some wounds heal. Bruises fade. Broken bones mend. Scars soften with time. But the wounds you can't see? Those last forever. For this girl the abuse is over. The locks are broken, the cage is empty. She is free. But inside her mind, she is still trapped. Because when a child is treated like an animal, like a prisoner, like they don't matter, they start to believe it. The psychological toll. Experts say that when a child is locked away, starved, humiliated, stripped of love and care, it rewires the brain. It changes the way they see the world. The way they see themselves. They learn that people can't be trusted. That love comes with pain. That asking for help is dangerous. And even when they escape, even when they are safe, those beliefs don't just disappear. This girl spent months in isolation. Months knowing that no one was coming for her. That kind of loneliness doesn't go away overnight. A psychologist explains. When a child is deprived of human connection, their brain develops differently. Fear becomes constant. Their body never truly relaxes. Even in safety, they're waiting for the next punishment. She will struggle to trust. She will struggle to sleep. She will flinch at sudden sounds, brace herself for anger, second-guess every kindness. Because in her world, kindness never lasted. And then there's the question no one wants to ask. Will she ever recover? Some children do. Some find love, stability, therapy, support. They fight to rebuild themselves piece by piece. But some never fully escape their past. The nightmares stay. The self-doubt lingers. The fear, the shame, the scars, they never really leave. So what about her? Where will she go? Who will fight for her now? Because the people who were supposed to protect her, they failed. The system that should have saved her, it let her suffer. And now, after everything she survived, she faces the hardest battle of all, learning how to live. But the question remains, is she truly safe now? Or is there something even darker waiting ahead? This case isn't over. The arrests were just the beginning. The court hearings? The media coverage? They don't erase what happened. Because this girl, she lived it. Day after day. Night after night. She knows the truth in a way no one else ever will. The cold. The hunger. The loneliness. And now, as the world watches, as people demand justice, the question remains. Will they pay for what they did? What happens if they're convicted? Jammy Jackson. Patricia Madrid. They face 14 felony charges. Child abuse. Neglect. Conspiracy. If convicted, they could spend decades behind bars. But could. Because the justice system is unpredictable. Plea deals. Reduced sentences. Loopholes. We've seen it before. Monsters walking free. And if that happens here? If the people who did this get to live normal lives while their victim suffers forever? What does that say about us? The call to action. This case is horrifying. But the truth is, it's not rare. There are children right now living in fear. Behind closed doors. Hiding bruises. Starving. Silenced. Waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. Waiting for someone to care. So if something feels wrong, speak up. If a child seems afraid, withdrawn, malnourished, say something. Because silence lets this happen. If you suspect child abuse, don't wait. Call for help. National Child Abuse Hotline. 1-800-4-CHILD 1-800-422-4453. 911 for immediate danger. Final haunting thought. She spent months trapped in a chicken coop. Months wondering if she would ever be free. And now the truth is out. Now the world knows her story. And now we are watching. Because this case isn't just about what's already happened. It's about what happens next. Will justice be served? Or will this girl once again be left to suffer alone?